And now that you know all about named exports, in this video, we're going to learn about the other type of export, that is the default export. With named exports, we know we can have as many as we like. For example, I have square and add, but I could add 20 more if that's what I needed for this file. With default exports, we can just have one. It wouldn't make sense to have two default values. You just have one default value. So each file, if it wants to, can choose to set up a single default export. We're going to go ahead and mess around with that by creating a brand new const. We'll call this one subtract, and this is just going to be one of our many useless little math operators that sit inside of this file. I'll set it equal to a function that takes in a and b, and right here we're just going to return a minus b. Perfect. So we have this subtract function. Now we already know how we could set it up as a named export and load that in, but we want to explore how we can set it up as a default export. So how do we do that? We're going to first explore how we do it using the export syntax down below. Then we'll look at how we can do it inline a bit later. So I'm going to remove the inline export for square and add, and I'm going to bring this line back in. Now this currently sets up square and add as named exports. We're going to go ahead and toss subtract into the mix too. Now currently this is a named export, not a default. To set this up as the default export right afterwards, as default is what we're going to use. Now remember, you can only have a single default export. So if I were to also use that over here, we're going to get an error if we were to try to run this code. You can have 0 or 1. You cannot have more than 1. So we have subtract set up as a default, and that means that we need to figure out how we can access that default, because if we try to use the import statement we already know about, we're never going to be able to grab subtract. So inside of app.js, I am going to comment out the person example. You'll be expanding on it later, so let's leave that in place. And I am going to uncomment the utils example. Now, if we toss subtract right in here, this is going to look for a named export called subtract, and we do not have one. We just set it up as the default, which means that if I were to use console.log and I called subtract, we would actually get a reference error. So right here, I'm going to try to subtract. Let's take 100 and remove 81, ending up with 19. Now, if I save app.js, as I mentioned, we're going to get an error over inside of the console. Why are we getting an error? We're getting an error because we're trying to import something that the file never exports. The file has 3 exports, a default and 2 named ones. So if we want to grab the default, we actually don't reference that inside of the curly braces. Instead, we put it just before the curly braces. So in our case, it would be subtract, comma space, and there we have it. Now we have the default export, and if we save app.js, everything is going to work as expected. Right here, we get 19, which is great. Now, there's no requirement to have any exports. You could have some named, some defaults. You could also just have a default if you wanted to. Right here, if I just cared about grabbing that default, I could remove the comma, the curly braces, and I would end up with something like this. That is perfectly valid, as long as I comment out the usages for the methods that I just removed. If I save the file, we still get 19. So I'm going to revert those changes, bringing back the calls to square and add and the imports for square and add. And I want to talk about what makes the default special. One important thing to know about the default export is that you don't have to grab it by name, because we know it's the default. So behind the scenes, we know whatever we put here should just get its value from the default export. So while I could call it subtract, and that might make sense in situations, I could call this anything I want. And as long as I reference the exact same thing down below, the application is still going to work as expected. So I'm going to take 100 and I'm going to remove 20, ending up with 80. If I save app.js, that is exactly what I get over here in the console. And this is something that we can't just do with our named export. So with defaults, the naming is not important because you're just grabbing the default export. We can call this anything we want, but it's usually a good idea to stick to something that makes a little bit of sense. So I'm going to switch this back to subtract. I'm going to switch it up there, and I'll switch it down below. Perfect. Now the application is still going to work. Obviously, we've just changed the name for the default export. There are no hard and fast rules about when to use named exports and when to use default exports. If a file has one big main thing that it's trying to export, I'll typically set up that as the default, and I'll set up these smaller things as named exports. So for example, if I had a file that was just responsible for creating a single React component, something we'll be doing a ton throughout the course, I would probably set up that one big React component as the default export. We'll be exploring a ton of different situations where we use both, and we're going to be using third-party libraries that have different opinions as well. So we'll be able to see a wide variety of usages of both the default and named exports. Now, what I'd like to explore is an alternative way we can actually set up that export. Obviously, if we're going to import it, we have to use this syntax, but as we saw in the previous video, there were actually two ways to set up our exports. We were able to do it down below in one shot, but we were also able to do it in line, and we did that by adding export in front of both of our const declarations. So right here, we had that, and this successfully set up the named export square, and it successfully set up the named export add. Now, we can't do that right here because if we did, we would have a named export. So what we're going to do instead is figure out how we can set up a default export. And to do that, we use export default. Now, there's a big difference between export default and export. Export default cannot come before a variable declaration like const subtract. So export default, if I were to run this, we would actually get an error. I'm going to remove this down below, save utils.js, and over here you can see we're getting an error relating to parsing the module because this is an invalid usage of export default. If we want to use export default, we can't put an entire statement after it. Instead, we just need to put a single expression. So export default, and right here we can just reference the subtract variable. Now this is going to correctly set up this function as the default, and over inside of the browser you can see we still get 80 back. Now you might say, whoa, this isn't really even in line. We still have 2 lines responsible for getting this done. Is there any other way? Sure. We could actually remove the need for subtract altogether. It's really doing nothing for us. We just create it here and we reference it down below. We could actually take our function, cut it out, and paste that right here, which is just an expression. Now if we remove the const subtract, we can save utils.js, and over inside of the browser, you can see we are still getting 80. So the default export is still correct, even though we switched it over to using this new syntax. So just like we saw with named exports, there are 2 ways to get the job done. We could do it all in one shot if we want, or we can do things one at a time throughout the file as they are declared. Either way gets the job done. Now it's your turn to use default exports. You're going to be setting up Person with a new function. It is going to be a default export. Then you're going to grab it over here in app.js and use it. So let me outline what I'd like you to do. I'm going to comment out the utils example, and I'm going to bring back the person example. And what we're going to do is set up a single new function. Now I'll show you the usage. It's going to be console.log is senior. Is senior is going to take in a number, for example, 65. It's going to return true if that person is considered a senior citizen in your country and false otherwise. The cutoff is 65 commonly in the United States. Feel free to switch up that value for your country. So 65 would return true and 64 would return false. So you're going to be setting up the default export and function. Then over here, you are going to grab the default and call it. Now I already have the call in place, so you just need to define the function, export it, and import it. Remember, make sure to use a default export as opposed to a named export. The whole point of this is to get some experience using the brand new syntax. Take some time to knock this one out, test your work. When you're done, go ahead and click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock that one out. We're going to be setting up a new function over here, and I'm going to choose to do it all in one shot, which means we can define the const first and then export it down below. Const is senior. And then I'm going to set this up to be our function, which takes in the age and returns true if the age is greater than or equal to 65. Perfect. Now we're going to set this up as the default export right here is senior as default, and that is it for the person file. Now we can go ahead and actually grab that default by adding it right before the curly braces. Is senior, comma space, and there we have it. Now our call is already set up, so if I save app.js, everything is going to work as expected. We're getting false for 64, and if I switch this over to 65, we're getting true. Excellent. Now remember, just because I call it is senior over here doesn't mean I have to use the exact same name over here. Maybe in person.js, I call it is senior citizen. and I'll reference that down here as well. And this is perfectly valid. We're exporting is senior citizen as the default. And remember, we can call it whatever we want over here when we import it. One of the great advantages of the default export. So the code still works even though the name is different in both. What is important is that it's set up as the default, and that is enough for Webpack to piece the two together. That's it for this one. Let's take just a quick moment to recap what we learned. We learned that any given file can choose to set up as many named exports as they like, and if they want to, they can set up a single default, though it's not required. We also learned that in order to grab that default, we provide a name for it up above before the curly braces. Now, this name can be anything we like. It's not important. What is important is its position. So it needs to come right here, and that is what allows Webpack to figure out that the default value should be tossed on the is senior variable in this particular case, though I could have called it anything I liked. Now that we know a bunch about the import and export keywords, which are available because we are using Webpack, let's go ahead and figure out how Webpack can actually work with React. In the next video, we're going to be using the import statement to import third-party dependencies from NPM. I'm very excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you next time.